Greetings and welcome, everyone. I'm just going to give everyone a moment to file in and we'll get started in a moment. All right, let's go ahead. So, welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kyle Shabasta. I work on the Policy Impact Project, and with me today are my colleagues at the Policy Impact Project, Anne Rue and Kylie McLean. The Policy Impact Project is a venture of the Policy and Analytics Center at the A.J. Drexel Autism Institute. We at the Policy Impact Project use research findings to hopefully propel systems level policy solutions that ultimately improve the lives of autistic people and those with other developmental disabilities by facilitating the translation of research into policy. Uh, we share knowledge effectively, hopefully, spread findings widely. We hope to inform decision makers, also influence policies and actions. We seek to engage with our peers and foster collaboration and feedback. And our ultimate goal is to advance research projects and inspire future investigations. So that is why we are happy to be facilitating today's Policy Power Lunch. What's in your advocacy toolbox? Building the skills to connect with policymakers. We are all researchers, content experts, advocates, self-advocates wanting to make an impact on policy, and that's what we are going to be ultimately discussing today. Before we begin, though, let me just run over some slight logistics. To ask a question to a panelist, please write your question in the Q&A box below. There will be some time at the end where we would have a facilitated Q&A section. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please write your comment in the chat box and someone will respond to you directly. If you're interested in closed caption, there is a CC icon below, so please select that at your own convenience. And with the speaker's consent, we are recording this webinar and it will be available on our website for later viewing. So thank you everyone for joining us. And with us today, we have Nicole Jorwick, the Chief of Advocacy and Campaigns at Caring Across Generations, Kim Mushano, Executive Vice President of Public Policy at the Autism Society, and Denise Roselle, Director of Policy Innovation at AUCD. Thank you all for joining us. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Kylie to ask some introductory questions.
Great. Thank you, Kyle. So we will start. I'm just going to ask you each to go a little bit further into where you work, what you do, and what your policy work focuses on, including at the level that you work at, the federal, the state, the local. And then briefly, just to provide an explanation to our audience about what you how you would define a policymaker. So why don't we go with Nicole, Kim, and Denise?
Sure. Thank you so much to the Policy Impact Project for hosting this. It's always good to be in conversation and with the great folks on the screen, and really great to be with you all virtually or if you're listening to the recording. My name is Nicole Jorwick. I use she, her pronouns. You've already heard my title, so I won't repeat it. I am with Caring Across Generations. Caring Across Generations is an organization that has been around for about a dozen years. That's goal is to build a movement to build the care infrastructure that we need in this country. And that movement includes family caregivers, disabled people of all ages, seniors, as well as care workers. I've been in that role for a while. I also, for almost 3 years, which is hard to believe. Before that, I was at the ARC of the United States for nearly 7, where I focused on public policy at both the state and federal level. At Caring Across, I also continue to lead both the state and federal policy work, and we also do some local policy work. As an example, I will be next month moderating a caregiving town hall in Marin County in California, because that's one of the states that we work in. So there's a lot of ways to address all of the issues that we're working on. The big focus in my policy career has been home and community-based services, for both expanding access to those services and addressing the workforce workforce crisis. I've also have a long history of working on advancing competitive integrated employment for people with disabilities. So those are some of the issue areas that I've focused on. I can talk all day about HCBS. I'm excited to be here to talk about it a little bit more today. And to answer your last question, Kylie, a policymaker is anybody who gets to make a decision about how money is spent. And that can be a local comptroller, that can be a state legislator, a federal legislator. It can be somebody who works for an agency. So much of the work that we do also has to do with regulatory work. And so those policymakers are also the folks that work for state and federal agencies as well as local agencies. I'll turn it over to Kim.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks for having me. Again, my name is Kim Mushino. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy at the Autism Society of America, the nation's oldest and largest grassroots organization, having started in 1965 to support those with autism and their families. I've been in this role for 6 years now, but in the disability policy arena for, over 25 years now, working with the DD councils, the ARC of the United States, and 17 years at Denise's organization, AUCD. We are a very small policy shop with one individual in our policy team, Delancey, that works on state policy. We have a new director of a justice center, Carlene Ponder. I think Nicole answered the policy maker question pretty well, but I agree that it can be anybody at the federal, state, and local level that makes policy, and that could include, school board members even. So I bounce it over to Denise.
Okay. I am Denise Roselle. I use she, her pronouns. Quick description. I am a woman of a certain age with gray hair and glasses with clear frames. Today I've got on a blue sweater, and you can kind of see my pink shirt underneath it. So who am I? I'm Denise Roselle, Director of Policy Innovation at AUCD. Some of you are saying, what is AUCD? AUCD is the Association of University Centers on Disabilities, which is a national professional membership organization supporting and promoting a national network of university-based interdisciplinary programs. Our membership includes the UCEDs, the University Centers of Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, the LEND programs, that's Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities, and the IDDRCs, the Eunice Kennedy Shriver Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Research Centers. So it's trainees, it's university centers, and it's actually some of the research people who are doing that kind of the bench research, as well as qualitative and other quantitative research. There are these programs, not all of them in every state, but across the US and the territories. They do research, do programs, they provide training, they disseminate information, all of that. And then and act as a bridge between the community and the universities. My background, I've been around, I can top Kim's, I've been around in the field probably 35 years, starting with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I've probably worked on just about every piece of legislation on some level in some type since then. I've done education, I've done employment, I've done civil rights, voting, all kinds of things just over time, as a lobbyist for varying organizations within the developmental disabilities world, the blindness world. I was at Easter Seals for about 16 years doing state government relations, and now at AUCD. At AUCD, my priorities tend to be less in the direct lobbying. We could have a long conversation about that lobbying world, and more in helping people understand policy. My portfolio, if you will, is basically transition age youth. So that's competitive integrated employment, transition, think college, so inclusive post-secondary education for students with intellectual disabilities. Anything that fits in that. We worked on the Promise Grant. There's all kinds of things that fit in there, but think transition age youth. And then think helping people understand how to tell. What really gets me excited these days is teaching other people to tell their stories. I've done the go around on the hill stuff that Kim and Nicole still do. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But these days I like teaching other people to tell their stories, and particularly in the inclusive post-secondary world, helping students in those programs learn to tell their stories. I call myself a policy geek. So everything I do is policy related. So the question about policymakers is kind of interesting. The only thing I would build on from both Nicole and Kim's answers, I want to say out loud that a policymaker is not a Democrat it is Democrats and Republicans and independents and people who label themselves whatever they label themselves. This is not, and disability traditionally has been a bipartisan or nonpartisan, depending on how you want to look at that field. There are times when we have had leadership on the Republican side. There are times when we had leadership on the Democratic side. There are times when we've had leadership that did not identify themselves any one way or another. And then I would also like to say that it's all kinds of people who make decisions. And I'll even expand it beyond Nicole's, who make decisions about money, and go to say who make decisions about how programs are run. Now, ultimately, that goes back to federal money, probably in the federal case, but how are programs run? The Higher Education Act, IDEA, some of those are civil rights acts that clearly policymakers were involved with that are not necessarily money related. So think big, and think big in terms of local, state, and federal. And I'll also add that I work these days, as I said, I built the state government relations program at Easter Seal, so I love state government work. These days I'm doing state and federal, not so much local, but teaching folks how to influence their state and federal legislators. So there you go.
Tremendous. Thank you all for being here and sharing your years of knowledge. Nicole, Kim, Denise, thank you. And Denise, to your point about providing capacity for folks to tell their stories, stories are a huge tool to have in your advocacy toolbox. So that's wonderful. So my first question is to Kim. So our goal, we're working to connect policymakers with the numbers we have, with the autism research that we are doing here. Can you walk us through and explain the process of getting policy change across the finish line using research? Where are the leverage points for inserting research findings into this process? Can you kind of give us
Sure.
some help?
And and we love the Policy Impact Project and all the research that Drexel and the Autism Institute do. And naturally, we need and use this type of research and data to inform policymakers all across the levels that Denise and Nicole mentioned. So the example of Autism Cares Act, which is we're in the process of reauthorizing that law right now. The process was started 2 years ago of getting our coalition together, gathering information from our members and our coalition members on what are the gaps. We learn, as laws are reauthorized, and the reason for reauthorizing is to figure out how to improve the law, what changes need to be made. So you look at the gaps, and we need the research and data to see what gaps are there and how can we improve the law. So we started 2 years ago, asking our members and our collective coalition members what changes needed to be made. Of course, one of our big data points is that we now have 1 in 36 diagnosed as having autism, and that has increased. In the 2010s, I think it was 1 in 88. And so every every time the CDC does their surveillance in the field, we find that there's more, and of course, there's plenty of reasons for that. And you all have identified some of those for our policymakers. And that's what we use when we go to the Hill and talk about the need to reauthorize the Autism Cares Act. That's one of our first data points. And then, of course, we look to HRSA, who's collecting data on the health professionals in the field, and we talk about thanks to Denise for already saying all the acronyms. So we talk about the need for the LEND programs that are, training our health professionals in an interdisciplinary nature. And we talk about how many health professionals are trained every year by the LEND programs and the developmental pediatrics. We use the number that we don't have enough developmental pediatricians. There's only 600 approximately across the country. So one of our asks is to do a GAO report, a General Accounting Office report, to figure out what are the challenges there. And then, of course, we use the other data points that we're hearing about are, people that don't have their communication needs met. So we're asking Congress to do more research on communication needs of those with autism and other intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I could go into more details about the other areas we're working on, but so basically our process then is, putting together the data that help us explain the problems and that lead to policy solutions. And that's how we educate policymakers. And I focus on the federal level. And then we do the best that we can to get our coalition all together so that when we go to Capitol Hill to talk to policymakers, we try as best we can to have as much consensus as we can on our asks. And that makes it easier for policymakers to be able to confidently, make decisions on, and it helps us to move the bill. And it's not easy. It's not easy to get everybody to come together on certain legislation so that we can easily move it through the House and Senate.
Thank you so much, Kim. I appreciate you sharing the ways you leverage research in the policymaking process, and the ways that research could be doing more. So our next question is for Nicole. You mentioned home and community-based services, or HCBS. We know that individuals who use or wish to use HCBS through Medicaid still face significant challenges in access, such as waiting lists, direct support worker shortages. And these issues may be removed from policymakers' lives as they are not HCBS users. So can you talk a little bit about how you help amplify HCBS users' needs and voices in policy conversations?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Kylie. So when we're talking about home and community-based services, we're talking about the services that are funded by the Medicaid program. The Medicaid program is the main funder when it comes to providing these services. And I'm saying that because there's a lot of misunderstanding in public education that's needed, even for folks that receive those services. We learned that when we had to defend the program in 2017, that even folks who have those services, when they were at risk, when we were saying that there were going to be trillions of dollars cut from the program, I would have folks calling my office saying, well, that doesn't impact me, I'm on the waiver. Well, a waiver is a home and community-based service system. Job coaching is a home and community-based service. It's just a really important thing. So just wanted to spend a little bit of a moment talking about the breadth of services that we're talking about when we're talking about home and community-based services. And part of why they're always at risk is, even though they are not optional for the people like my brother Chris, who has autism and is 35 and uses them, they are optional under the law, which is why there can be waiting lists, which we're working on fixing, and definitely encourage folks to join us in our fight to do that. But the reality is that it is something that it's a complicated system. Medicaid's complicated. All of this is, we're talking about waivers of the Social Security law. You don't need to be experts in any of that. And frankly, the most effective way to get policymakers to understand is to elevate the stories and the voices of those who use home and community-based services. Data is so incredibly important, and we had every data point that we needed when we're talking about building access to services or defending them. But the things that change policymakers' minds are the stories. I could read off all of the data, but when I would talk about my brother Chris's experience and what his day-to-day life is like, because he has access to those services, the fact that he could have been at risk of an institutionalization unnecessarily if he didn't have it, and the fact that those services allow my parents to work, those sort of things, that's the pieces that really matter. And it's great, sure, that I can say it when I'm in the offices, but it's more important that the person with a disability themselves is the one that's sharing their story. And so the biggest thing that I say when you're working on policy is that you don't have to, because sometimes it can be really intimidating to think we're talking about these complex issues. The only thing that you have to be an expert on, and so the thing that I do to encourage these stories to be the ones that are leading, is making sure that folks know that they don't have to be an expert in anything other than their own story. So the best ways to get involved and the best ways to share your stories are to obviously get on the list of Caring Across Generations, Autism Society, AUCD, other groups that are going to be asking for you to be sharing your story, providing opportunities to be sharing your story, but also look out to having folks really talk to those policymakers. And as Kim and Denise and I all said, that's a wide berth of what policymakers look like, in lifting those pieces up, because that's really how we're going to get it seen. And that's really how we're going to be able to have folks understand too what the workforce crisis does look like in the impact, because my brother's progress is impacted when he doesn't have a stable workforce. And right now, the only folks that he has are people that were related to or that he's known since he was in school. And that's not an effective system. And so those are the kind of stories that need to be out there to get the changes that we need. And I will say I've seen a lot of growth in understanding of legislators because of people with disabilities sharing their stories and putting a face on the issues when they're having to vote on them.
Thank you, Nicole. I appreciate that. We have a couple of questions. So someone asked, what's the access rule and how that's relative to HCBS?
Sure. The HCBS access rule is a rule that was just finalized by the Biden administration in April. It is a rule that doesn't have any money attached, but is really important because part of what is one of the many things that's complicated about Medicaid is that the rates for Medicaid have never really fully supported the costs of actual services. And so what the access rule requires is that every state is going to have to put together a board of folks, a board of stakeholders that will include people with disabilities. It should include AUCD members. It should include providers. It should include direct care workers, to every 2 years look at the rates, the Medicaid rates that are being paid. So that's a really important component of the rule. It also has requirements of that 80% of funding going from the Medicaid rate actually goes to workers, which is also important. With a note, which is that the majority of home and community-based services are actually not, that people with IDD rely on, are actually not covered under the access rule because habilitation services were not included. I will say, and can share some inside DC baseball, is that was because they think that that's something that they can hook on later. They wanted to get this out into the world. And the reality is that rate setting entity will be helpful regardless. But so that's probably more of an answer than you needed, but figured I would just share that unfortunately it doesn't go that far, but it's much easier, right, with a regulation once it's out there as a final rule, which the access rule is, to add to it. And so that's what our goal will be next year.
Appreciate you clarifying that. One more piece I want to add into here is someone asked, as an HCBS user, what are the best ways to get involved in that? And feel free, anyone who would like to answer that.
Oh yeah, sorry, I was answering that when I said join all of our lists. Um, and sorry, I was reading it as I was talking. Zoom Life, what I'm used to, but yeah, and so getting involved in groups that are working on it, and just generally getting involved in the process in your state around the access rule or around any HCBS advocacy is making sure that you know what your state Medicaid agency is even called, because in different states they're called different things. In my home state of Illinois, it's called HFS. In other states, it's the Department of Mental Health. So really just having an understanding of where those things are happening so you can look out for when they're looking for input or folks to come and testify, as well as other opportunities in the legislature. That's just a couple examples.
And I'm going to jump in and say another way to do that is to make sure that you know, particularly, well, federal and state, but particularly your federal legislators. If you don't know them, go introduce yourself. Tell your story that you are a user of HCBS services, and this is why those services are important to you. And this is why those services allow you to work, allow you to get out of your home, allow you to all of the things that whatever it is that fits for you. Because there will be, I think we will be facing some Medicaid challenges in upcoming years. We'll see, but we will need you telling those stories. And you, again, as Nicole said, you are the best person. You are the only person who can tell your story. And then we can build. Those of us who do this work professionally, can build, in the stuff behind that. And then I said I started with federal, but I'm also going to say, and if you don't know your state legislators, go meet them too, for the same reason, because a lot of these decisions get made at the state level on how your state Medicaid is and HCBS services are provided. So that's an easy way to start. Get to know them, go to a town hall, ask a question, go and know your story, practice how you're going to tell your story. But I think that's another way. And then as you join bigger groups of people who are doing that, you may see other things that you can hook into.
I would agree. I agree with Denise that the state level is a really good place to get your state to take up the many options in Medicaid.
Right.
Medicaid offers so many options, but it's up to
Yeah.
the state to
Right.
decide to take them up and
Yeah.
then use that money for people.
Yeah.
And then also, you know, complaining complaining to the Department of Justice helps as well. The Department of Justice just came out with a lawsuit in Maine, and forcing Maine to put more money into their home and community-based services, because there are folks that are being unnecessarily institutionalized or referred to emergency rooms or law enforcement.
Wonderful. Thank you so much all for those thoughtful answers. I'm hearing a lot about coalition building, storytelling, testimonies, all really, really powerful tools. So thank you for that. My next question is for Denise. How do you see the policy landscape changing and evolving for post-secondary education and employment for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities?
Sure. So I said earlier that I spend a lot of my time working on inclusive post-secondary education for students with intellectual disabilities. And that's, some people shorthand that as TIPSIDS. You don't need to know what that means, or somehow refer to the Think College. Think College is the Technical Assistance Center that does a lot of the work on this. We are really excited in this world. This is a field that really didn't exist 20 years ago. And it has grown and grown. There are over 300 programs across the country now. And again, I'm going to separate out a little bit because I can talk. There are programs for students with intellectual disabilities. There are different programs in some places for students with autism. There are different programs in some places for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It kind of depends on what the program looks like. And there's exciting things happening in all of those arenas. The one I'm going to mostly talk about is intellectual disabilities, which does include students with autism if they have an intellectual disability as well. And the only reason, before anybody asks about it, the only reason that that is the way it is because that's how it's defined in federal statute. So the statute says inclusive post-secondary education for students with intellectual disabilities, because those students were not having, really hadn't had any kind of college or post-secondary experience in the past. So these programs are fully inclusive. They are on college campuses. Students are going, they are earning certificates, they are earning credentials. What's exciting about it is watching the growth. Over 8,000 students over time have been through these programs. Some of those students go out to and carry on with community college programs or additional college programs. But many of those students, and depending on the program you're looking at, the numbers are just tremendous, in this like 67 to 70% of students coming out of those programs go to competitive integrated employment. And for any of you who are on the research side, you know that the numbers for students with intellectual disabilities, the numbers for people with intellectual disabilities who are not in similar programs, is abysmally low. So the fact that we have students in these programs coming out, going into competitive integrated employment, and in jobs they want, not just in the 4 Fs of, florists and filth and food and whatever the last one is, which I always forget. So the fact that they're coming out and going into competitive integrated employment is a big deal. I will add, and I think you're hearing all of us talk a lot about stories. I cannot tell you what it is like to walk in. I mean, you'd have to be there to walk into a member's office, state or federal, with a student in one of these programs who was wearing, I always use Vanderbilt because for some reason, if you walk into a Tennessee office with a Vanderbilt t-shirt on, everybody goes, "Oh, Vanderbilt, oh my gosh, were you a student?" I can't tell you what it's like to walk into one of those offices with a student with an intellectual disability who is in the program at Vanderbilt, who wants to run their own food truck in the future and can talk about that and talk about the classes they're taking and talk about why they're in college and why they think that there should be more college programs like these. The story is incredible. Somebody just did that. Thank you very much. Factories was the one I forgot. Flowers, filth, food, and factories. I knew there were 4 Fs. It's giving these students the opportunity to find what they are good at and what they want to do. So interesting things happening. As I say, it's a new field. Programs are growing all the time. There are now 7 regional alliances of these programs around the country. 48 of the 50 states are in an alliance that's working together to continue to build programming in that region of the country. There's only one state that does not have a similar program, and that's Wyoming, and they're working on it. I also want to talk about accreditation. You ask what's coming. When these programs started, there was no particular way to measure what the programs were doing, other than what's in the statute itself. The Higher Education Opportunity Act created a federal model demonstration project, and they set some standards. Things like you have to be at least 50% in inclusive classes. We all think it should be more than that, but at least 50% in the statute back from 2008. There are a variety of things that are required. If you meet those requirements, that was the only thing that we could judge anything by. And so over the past, what would that be, 15 years, there's been a lot of work around developing accreditation standards, testing those standards. And now 3 schools have gone through the accreditation process and become accredited. So we are moving. I can't tell you now that 3 schools out of over 300 around the country, we're moving in the right direction. We at least have standards now that you can judge against. You at least now know these 3 schools have been accredited, and there are more going through the process. So that's a big deal in this field and will move us forward, I think, in some important ways. There's lots more research out there on this than there ever was in the beginning. And you just see article after article after article coming out about it. And that's really exciting to see the data. We've all talked about personal stories, but let's be honest, you also have to have the data. You have to have both. And you use both. And in appropriate ways, you use both in appropriate settings. So that's another thing to say about that. And then employment, what's coming on employment? Oh my goodness. All kinds of things are coming on employment, I hope. So clearly students in these programs that I'm talking about coming out in competitive integrated employment, big deal. But there's also a lot going on around, and I would be horrible if I didn't talk about sub-minimum wage. As I'm sure everyone on this call knows, sub-minimum wage for people with intellectual disabilities and for those with disabilities continues under the Fair Labor Standards Act, Section 14C, which gives a waiver so that people in 14C programs who have a waiver can be paid underneath the minimum wage. This is a fight that goes on across the country at different levels. So it's another good example of how to influence at your state level and at your federal level. There are 14 states who have done away with sub-minimum wage. There are a couple more that are moving toward that, but federally, it is still a federal, you can still pay sub-minimum wage in other states, in some of the states who have not done that. There is a piece of legislation currently called Transformation to Competitive Integrated Employment Act, which would do away with it would phase out 14C, that sub-minimum wage, while at the same time providing some funding from the federal government to help providers phase out and move into a new paradigm. I said in my introduction that I am, I didn't quite say I'm old, but I'm old. I've been around a long time. And we've been having this conversation the entire 35 years I have been in this field. And I think I can say I finally feel like we're at the tipping point. I think we're finally moving to a stage where we might actually see this happen at the federal level. States continuing to work on it. And the other thing that at least we haven't seen it. This is another, fingers crossed. This is another comment. That's the federal level. That's the state level. There are regulatory things, which is why regulations are also important, that we think are happening. The Washington Post, a couple weeks ago, reported that there is a draft rule about 14C at the Office of Management and Budget. Or at least I don't know. We don't know what that rule says. We don't know how far it goes. We don't know whatever, but we are hopeful that perhaps that federal rule would continue to move us away from some minimum wage.
Yeah.
So there's lots of exciting things happening in the employment world as well. And I'm sure any of us could add more exciting things in employment, but that's a good start.
Yeah, that's more than a good start. I just wanted to add that I feel comfortable enough saying out loud that I think we should expect to see something in October from the federal government that might go further than I think any of us could have hoped.
I sincerely hope Nicole is right and that she has better information than I do, because that would be exciting.
The acting secretary of the Department of Labor may have spoken at an event for us a couple weeks ago. That's all I'll say.
Okay, that works for me. But what's interesting about it is it's a great example of how you can influence policy and policymakers in all kinds of different ways. If that happens, for instance, I assume, Nicole, it would come out as an NPRM and we would look for comments, and that it would be open to comments from the public. And that's another way to influence policy, to go in and make a public comment, because there absolutely will be public comments against whatever comes out. So that's another way to do it.
Nicole making news right here.
Yeah.
Well, it was in the Washington Post, so I felt a little comfortable
No,
on the ledge.
The Post says it's there, but I don't know what it would say. So if you have better news, that's awesome.
Yeah, and it's going to be a final rule. They've already gotten comments.
So we don't have to. Thank you, Nicole. This is why you have multiple people on a call. So in this particular case, we won't need your comments. In this particular case,
but a lot of support.
We'll need it for other things. We will need it for other things.
Great. Thank you all so much. And everyone keep posting questions into the Q&A. We'll tackle those towards the end. And there's also a really interesting conversation happening in the chat about, again, leveraging research to be more practical for policymakers. So thank you to the panelists for jumping in and answering those. So
Can I say out loud the words I haven't been reading the context in the chat because unlike Nicole, I can't do those many things at once. But if there's any concept, if I don't say the words plain language out loud, when it comes to making things accessible for policymakers as well as accessible for people with disabilities, I will never forgive myself. So if you're looking at how to make research usable for policymakers, plain language, plain language, plain language.
Yep.
Thank you, Denise. Everyone's heads are nodding on that one. So we have about 2 more questions that we prepared. And really quickly, let's discuss the Supreme Court. So this year, the standard that allowed courts to turn to federal agency experts for advice on law enactment was overturned. Could you give an elevator speech comfortable on the panel about what happened overturning the Chevron decision and why it matters to disability advocates and policy?
I'll let the lawyers in the room start.
Oh, that was sneaky.
Oh, you pass it to me?
Nicole, I'm passing to you.
I heard the silence. I was like, oh shoot, sorry. You're talking about Chevron, and I think what the most important, and this is it, thanks, Kim. Sorry. When Kim, Denise, and I met to prep and make sure that I think the biggest thing that makes it a little bit concerning for us as advocates is that what it really will mean is that it ties the hands of federal agencies. And when it comes to home and community-based services, or I mean, what we were just talking about around employment, a lot of those things aren't necessarily because the letter of the law that was passed say it. It's because the federal agency interprets it, puts out guidelines, puts out FAQs, puts out other things, puts out regulations that codify what's actually in the law. What Chevron does is says that agencies don't have that power, and which is problematic for a lot of reasons, because again, a lot of what has been advanced, et cetera, in the past, especially the last decade, has happened through regulations. It also is complicated because as advocates, working on developing new federal policies, it means we're going to have to get a lot more clear with the language to get it passed. And passing federal legislation is really, really, really hard. The biggest piece of legislation that we've had in the HCBS space is the American Rescue Plan Act funding that totaled almost $38 billion. I helped with drafting that language. That language had to be drafted in the most simple way, which is why I could help with it. And it was to strengthen the home and community-based service workforce and expand access to home and community-based services. Now, then that had to be interpreted by the agency. We only got it in because it was that simple. So that means that A, your agencies are going to have less power, and B, as advocates trying to pass legislation, especially bipartisan legislation, because all of our issues are nonpartisan, but the reality is that it's a very complicated time to get bills passed, and especially when the bills have big dollar amounts, which is all of the things that we're talking about because of the lack of investments over decades. And so it has that kind of Chevron is concerning for both really impacting the role of the agencies and also making it harder to pass good bills. Did I summarize what we talked about, Kim and Denise?
You did a great job.
And we also worry about it gumming up the courts, that some of the laws and regulations will be interpretations will be taken to court.
And I would add, I have to add, we don't know yet.
Yeah.
Part of the answer to this question is we just don't know, because it will take a lawsuit in all likelihood to challenge a regulation not being too specific or not as the statute says. But then what happens next, and which ones will get challenged, and which ones will, and what will that do, and how long? Anyone who's watching court processes, they are not fast to begin with. So then what happens? So a lot of this is kind of shrugged shoulders, which is actually why I said, oh shoot. this is shrugged shoulders saying we just don't know. If I think about, I said I started with the ADA. So the ADA is civil rights legislation, and it is very, I don't want to say simple, but it's very direct. You shall not discriminate against based on whatever, disability and ADA. You shall not. And then the regulations that interpret that are volumes. Particularly accessibility of buildings. There's all the individual stuff that you have to do to make a building accessible that the access board does, et cetera, et cetera. If they start challenging at that level, I don't even know how that works. So it's a concern. I mean, it's a big concern. Keep your ears open because, and read your newspapers or your, however you get your news. I still read a newspaper, but watch for it because we're going to have to watch how this plays out. And it's not, not just in disability. This is across the board. The Chevron case was not a disability case, and the one that
Right.
overturned it was not a disability case. It's just, across the board, across all the agencies. Um, and as Kim and Nicole both said, passing legislation is not easy. It's never been easy. And in a country that is this 50-50 right now, again, without being partisan, it's just we're not in agreement at the moment, and it's hard. And so to get a compromise so that something goes through, you often don't put the specifics in the bill. You let somebody else figure it out. Well, not sure who's going to figure it out now. So this is a tricky one. It's a great question. I just don't know that we're going to have an answer for a while.
We did have our legal intern do
Hmm.
an initial analysis related to the impact on disability, and I put that link in the chat so that you can read more about how it might impact disability policy.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. That is a big question. And you're right. There's a lot more to be determined, but I think in the meantime, just to reiterate for our audience, we're talking a lot about, the tools. So if I may go over those tools one more time, consensus,
Yeah.
coalition, research translated into plain language, stories, testimonies, and
Yeah.
willpower to speak directly to policymakers. So those are all the things we can kind of hold as we anticipate what the future will look like with the Chevron decision. So thank you all for kind of teeing us up with those questions. Question I have for the group. Has there been ever some surprise bipartisan support for a policy that you've seen? And what were some of the strategies behind garnering that support or excitement for a policy across the spectrum?
So when we talked about this in a pre-call, I think I said I would start because the first one that comes to my mind is the Americans with Disabilities Act in and of itself. That bill, now law, would never have passed without President George H.W. Bush, without Senator Orrin Hatch, who was very conservative from Utah, without Dick Thornburgh, who was a previous attorney general in Pennsylvania and then moved into the cabinet and working with the president. All of those people, Bob Dole, all of those people made that bill possible. And I've said many times, I don't think it would have passed without them. And some of them I wouldn't have expected. And the reason, and what was the strategy? Part of it was just talking to people. And again, hearing the stories. President George H.W. Bush had a daughter who died young from cancer. He understood disability. Dick Thornburgh had a son with an intellectual disability. He understood disability and what disability discrimination was. Orrin Hatch told a story on the floor of the Congress, the floor of the Senate, literally as we were trying to pass the bill, talking about his, I think it was brother-in-law who who was paralyzed, I believe World War II, but anyway, who was paralyzed and he would have to carry around at times. And again, and Bob Dole had a disability himself. So I come back to how important the personal stories are. You don't know people's personal stories. some of those people were very, very conservative, and I wouldn't have guessed at the time that they would be on a civil rights bill, kind of the biggest civil rights bill in decades. Yeah, decades. But the personal connection to it and having advocates go in and talk to them and make the personal connection got us. I mean, you never see a piece of legislation that is in numerous committees, numerous, come out about the way they went in unless you have bipartisan support. And that's what happened on ADA.
Yeah.
So,
You can't have any legislation pass without bipartisan
yeah.
support,
Yep.
in this
Yeah.
Congress especially. But yeah, and I brought up the example of the SSI bill, the work without worry. No, it was the SSI Savings Penalty Elimination Act. There's several bills trying to increase the asset limit for SSI. So this bill would increase the limits to $10,000 for an individual and $20,000 for a couple. Right now it's $2,000. So that's causing really unacceptable levels of poverty and hardship for people with disabilities. And it just hasn't been updated in decades. And so we were just really surprised when we had a Hill briefing on this bill, and we had J.P. Morgan Chase, the National Association of Evangelicals was there, Chamber of Commerce, the Orthodox Union, the Conference of Catholic Bishops, just such a wide range of people that are concerned about poverty and hardship. And so it just really shows that it pays to not just stay within your own small coalition, but to think about other coalitions that might be concerned. And you have to think about, like these CEOs, well, they want people to come and work for them, but they can't work if they have these asset limits. So you have to kind of think outside the box and think outside of your own small coalitions.
Yeah, and another bill that actually came to my mind after we got off, and I'm kind of embarrassed that it didn't make me think that I didn't think of it sooner, since it's the thing I've been lobbying on at the federal level for the longest, which is Money Follows the Person. Money Follows the Person is a program that actually got signed into law by President George W. Bush in 2005, and has had strong bipartisan support, including legislation to make the bill permanent. And a lot of that is, and this gets actually into the first question in the Q&A, so I'll try to I'll pivot us over there too, which is around how do you fight against funding cuts to Medicaid home and community-based services. And so Money Follows a Person is a great example of that bipartisan legislation, and also of how to have different talking points depending on what offices that you're going into. So Money Follows the Person, the reason it was a surprise in the beginning that it got support, just because it had a cost associated to it. But the reason that it has continued to have strong bipartisan support is that we can say, maybe to some offices, this is the part that matters, which is the fact that it has moved hundreds of thousands of people out of institutional based settings and into their homes and communities. It has been a living example of the meaning behind the Olmstead Supreme Court decision and the integration mandate of the Americans with Disabilities Act. In some offices, that's going to get them to sign on. In other offices, it's going to be the 20% per Medicaid beneficiary per month savings to the Medicaid program from moving somebody out of more expensive institutional care and into the home and community-based service. So the way to argue against funding is to make some of those points, because we're talking about really expensive investments, but that's because states and the federal government have invested in the wrong things for too long. And that's what we have to talk about. We have polling from Caring Across Generations that shows that 95% of people with disabilities want to be living in their homes and communities. That's not where the funding is. And so we don't have to make anybody feel bad about decisions that they've made in the past, but what we do have to do is say, hey, rebalancing, we've been doing this for decades. We need to actually have the rubber meet the road in terms of where the money is going to match with what people actually want in the community. And we can say, hey, there's going to be an upfront investment that you're going to need to do, but here's the savings that can come after. We have now longitudinal data of going back decades when we're looking at money follows the person, almost 20 years of data that shows the thing that advocates have been saying, which is if you make those investments, it's going to actually cost less. Kaiser Family Foundation found that the average cost of home and community-based services, which obviously will vary based on need, but is around $68,000 a year, whereas institutional services are well over $200,000. But again, so some of those data points are going to make sense for some folks, but the way to also fight against the funding cuts is the stories, is the testimonies, and is the real impact and the economic impact of what we don't have access to. The National Partnership on Women and Families found that $1 trillion of unpaid care is given to the economy because of the lack of a system that we have. Family caregivers like myself, like my parents, are filling in for what we don't have, and there are costs associated with that too. So just some of my Hill talking points, but there you go.
Well, I'm going to build on that for a second, Nicole, because I think that in some ways answers one of the questions in the Q&A, which has to do with the question came about ADA and about Dick Thornburgh, and this, is how does that work? He's putting him as a conservative doesn't really work in today's landscape. At least that's the way I'm reading the question. And the answer is you talk to different people differently. It's not that there are different questions and different things you emphasize. It's
Right.
not that you're giving them giving different people different information. You're trying to emphasize things that are important to them. And there are the financial things may be much more interesting to folks who are more conservative fiscally, obviously. The civil rights piece may be much more interesting to somebody who is more progressive or has a civil rights context. It's knowing your data and using your data to tell the story that meets their needs. And keep in mind, it's not just that somebody who's a representative is conservative. They were elected. So they were elected by the people who live in their district. So their district reflects what they reflect. So you're giving answers to them that they can then take back to their district or their state that answer the questions that are being asked of them in their district or state. And the data's there, but you choose which things you use and how you answer the question. So I think that's an important piece of it. So it almost doesn't matter, although I will say Orrin Hatch, for goodness sakes, from Utah, was about as conservative as they come. So I would say that first on other issues. But on this one, he became a civil rights person on this issue back in the ADA days. But again, you go to them with what they want to hear. And part of the reason, I will go back once more to Orrin Hatch, part of the reason he answered the way he did, and he said the things he did, his own personal story, but he also had in his state a group of disability advocates who met with him regularly and talked about their issues. And he literally met with them regularly. And so those folks were telling their stories and bringing their data to him from within the state. So that also helped the work we were doing in Washington because he was hearing it at home too. So go back again to how important it is to be doing the work at home.
Wow, yeah. You all are speaking my language as a community organizer. Sometimes your tent is big, doesn't mean it's permanent, and sometimes you'll connect to constellations of people that you did not expect to
Never
connect
thought.
to. But in furthering the cause that you want to advocate for, sometimes that constellation or the tent is big. So that's all tremendous stuff. We are just about at time, but I would love for you all to close us out. This question is to each of you. What brief words of encouragement would you give to people looking to get involved in advocacy work, in policy, in even just learning about an issue they may have a vested interest in? What would you tell our audience members? Nicole, I'll start with you.
Sure. What I would say, my words of encouragement would be to keep showing up, I came to DC a little less than a decade ago, and I really tried to pay attention to and also know that like everyone's willing to talk to you and to help you. The Kim and Denise both. There's a lot of folks when I came into the national space that I had coffees with and conversations with, and I know they still do. I still do. Always still say yes to all of those inquiries that come into us. And also figure out what your unique voice is. I'm not the wonkiest person in the room, right? I enjoy doing some of the hill stuff. So my other word of encouragement is don't feel like you have to know everything. If you're a really strong researcher, we need really strong researchers. If you're a really good lobbyist, we need that. If you're an organizer, we need that. We need all of it, and you don't have to do it all. I think frankly, like what has been within the disability community is there's a lot of folks that were trying to do everything, and actually we need everything. So what I would encourage you to do is to get really good at what you're really good at, and to find folks who can fill you in so you can fill in the gaps that we have in the movement.
Tremendous. Denise?
I thought you were going to Kim first.
Oh, sorry.
So it just went out of my head. So I'm going to go to Kim. Would you answer so
Yeah,
I can try to pull
that
back the thought I just had? It was something
that
based on
was
what Nicole said.
that was really great advice, Nicole. And so I'll take a different tact and just, say that, you know, it can be really fun when you can share your story and get involved, um, at whatever level, like Nicole said, whatever you're good at. I mean, it could be at the local level, it could be at a school board meeting, and go and testify at a school board meeting. And then when you find that there is a policy change in the schools in part because you provided testimony, it's just really satisfying. I think that's what gets people started, is they feel that satisfaction. They go, "Oh, wow, my voice actually mattered," and then they decide to take it to another level, or continue on to a different issue. And so I would just encourage you to try, and go and listen to testimony, and think about what you're interested in. And I agree with Nicole, come and have coffee with one of us, and we can talk to you more about it. And Denise, did it jog your brain
Okay.
a bit?
So yes, it did. And both of you are saying this, but I'm going to say out loud, you can be a researcher, you can be a lobbyist, you can be a whatever. You also don't need to know every issue.
Right.
Pick an issue that you are passionate about,
Right.
and then work on that. And again, local or state or federal, but pick an issue that you know and that affects your life. I'm going to go back again to know that you can tell your story. And if you're a researcher, and I mean, perhaps you don't feel like you have a story. First of all, I think you do. But secondly, you work with people who do. You can either, with permission, share someone else's story, or you can help someone else share their story. So there's ways of building, I think, in doing that. And as Kim said, sometimes it's just a little teeny piece within. I mean, I joke about that I have a little sandbox. Think the inclusive post-secondary education really is, in the big scheme of things, a little itty bitty sandbox.
Mhm.
I play in that little itty bitty sandbox, and a couple of words will make a huge difference. We're fighting over an or and an and right now on something, and it will make a huge difference for students. And so, you can take a little teeny piece and work on it. And Kim's right. Then when you see it, it's magical when you see the change you can make, and you can make it.
Yeah.
Great place to land. And especially thank you right now for, providing such words of wisdom and encouragement to our audience. And to our audience, thank you for being with us today. Once again, this will be recorded and shared on our website. Take care all.
Thank you.
Thank you.